Happy Hour, the podcast that explores new and exciting historical fiction novels. I'm your host, Jane Healy, and in today's episode, we welcome award-winning author Suzanne Nelson to discuss her novel, The Librarians of Lisbon, a World War II story of love and espionage, which released on February 4th. Welcome, Suzanne. Thank you for coming.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about it with you tonight.
Me too. So I'm going to do a quick intro and then we'll dive into questions. Everyone, tell me where you're zooming in from and what you're reading. I always ask that at the beginning. So Suzanne Nelson is the award-winning author of dozens of middle grade novels, including You're Baking Me Crazy, amazing title, which was adapted into a movie for the Hallmark Channel. Her YA novel, Serendipity's Footsteps, was a Sydney Taylor honor book. She has written articles about parenting for the Washington Post and teaches writing workshops for adults and children. She loves reading and writing historical fiction. She lives with her family in Ridgefield, Connecticut. Again, welcome.
Thank you.
So let's dive in. Tell everyone about the inspiration, make sure I'm holding this up right, and the premise of this beautiful World War II story of Bea and Selene, two librarian friends from Boston who end up in Lisbon, of all places, Lisbon, Portugal, during the war and take on these fascinating roles.
Yeah, so really, I feel like this book, here I have it here too. I have the hardcover here. I feel like it really started with the characters and the location. That was really what the story was built around. And when I learned that Portugal was neutral during World War II, and it was this hub for Allied and Axis spies, sorry about that. It really everything kind of came together because I knew that librarians were recruited by the American government during World War II to go abroad into occupied Europe and also into Lisbon and Portugal and rescue manuscripts that were in danger of being looted from the Nazis and get them to safe locations. But also they were there to mine information and find artillery manuals and underground resistance newspapers and topographical maps, lots of information that the government prior to Pearl Harbor did not have. So when Roosevelt realized that he was seriously lacking in intelligence about the Axis powers, that was when he started recruiting academic scholars and librarians. So the book is, we call it, my editor and I call it Casablanca romance meets the espionage of James Bond world. And I think it really does that. The librarians that go there they go there initially to do this librarian work, but then they each get recruited for much more dangerous missions after they get there. And then the story kind of goes from there. But the characters are loosely inspired by scholars and librarians who were actively overseas during the war. So that seemed to mesh perfectly with Portugal and its neutrality and the fact that it was this playground for spies. And it was also this really fascinating location because it was also one of the only exit points from occupied Europe because of its neutrality. So you had these spies operating there, but then you also had exiled royals, you had authors and illustrators and scientists and mathematicians that were coming from occupied Europe and trying to leave to get to the United States and Brazil and Canada. So they were there, and a lot of times they got stuck there because they didn't have the proper paperwork to leave. So they just kind of lingered in Portugal, sometimes for months or even years. And then you had families and just regular people who were flooding into Portugal too, who were also trying to leave. So you had this great mashup of social circumstances and people that were all congregating in Portugal during those war years. And you also had this huge dichotomy of, the party atmosphere at the Casino Estoril and the palaces in Sintra. And then you had people in Lisbon who were trying to leave that couldn't get jobs and were living, some Lisboetas took them into their homes or they were living in hostels there. So it was really these two extreme worlds that coexisted during that time, which was just fascinating to me.
Yeah, and I think too, one of the things that I love, when I discover a new World War II book like this is like, I don't think Lisbon's been talked about enough in fiction, in World War II fiction, frankly. And so that was
Yeah.
really intriguing. I think and we'll talk more about Lisbon too as a setting, but I think that it's such a fascinating setting. I want to talk about Bea and Selene, two very distinct characters, very different from one another. Um, what was your character development like for these two friends? And I mean, obviously you've written many books, so I don't know if you have
Right.
a process for it or if this was different because this was an adult novel. Talk to me about that.
So, really, I think for them, I wanted them to be complete opposites. And I think everyone who's had deep and abiding friendships has one or maybe two of those rare friendships where you meet someone that pushes you to be this version of yourself that you wouldn't be around other people. And I think Bea and Selene both do that for each other. Selene is this outgoing, vivacious woman, but she's very cynical about men in the book. So because of her beauty and because everyone makes assumptions about her beauty and her talents because of her charm, that angers her. She wants to be respected for much more than that. And that's part of why she ends up in Lisbon. And then you have Bea, who is much more reserved, quieter, and she's also has her own story, her own backstory, for her reasons for going to Portugal, which I won't give away any spoilers, but she has secrets that she's harboring. And the two of them play off of each other. Their friendships, they bring out these, Selene kind of Bea tempers Selene's spontaneity and her recklessness, and Selene, encourages and brings out this aspect of Bea and encourages her to be more assertive, more outgoing, more adventurous. And I think as the book goes on, even though they're on these two parallel paths with two separate missions, what they know and love about each other feeds into the people that they grow into over the course of the novel.
Excellent. Yes, yeah, it's like a yin and yang thing. I love that.
Yeah, yeah.
I read your piece on crime reads in which you discussed how librarians don't really fit the stereotypical profile of what a spy would be, and yet they were very good spies. And the Office of Strategic Services, which was the precursor to the CIA,
Right.
recruited a lot of intellectuals, a lot of academics. Why do librarians make good spies?
I think it's the way that they think. I mean, you and I both do research when we take on historical fiction novels, and I love the research aspect of writing. That's one of my favorite parts. And and I think probably our brains work a little bit like librarians and academics' brains work in that respect. We're able to hone in on details. And what I read about the academics and scholars that were doing this during the war, they were fantastic. I mean, they could comb through directories and pull out names and manage to craft a narrative around that and be able to say, well, I think these people are really important to the Reich. Um, so they were crafting their own narratives based on the information that they were gathering, and that fascinates me. And I think we do that as writers too. We comb through all of these nonfiction books that we read when we're researching. We go visit places and take tours and gather facts, and then we're able to weave them into, in our cases, fiction with little tidbits of nonfiction. But I think academics and scholars were such a huge asset to the war effort. And it really, you don't realize so often what's going on behind the scenes, you know, the little green man behind the curtain. You don't see that person very often, but those women and men that were overseas that were doing that work and that were, you know, collecting, like Adele Kibre and Maria Josepha Meyer, they were collecting thousands of reels of microfiche film and sending it to the United States. They had documentation of access attacks on allied powers that the US government didn't really know fully about yet. They had a knack for really finding needles in haystacks, and they did, and they were great at it.
And amazing. I know. And I think you're right too. It wasn't a lot of spy work is not glamorous. It's actually very labor intensive and tedious and, you know, all about like digging in. And I think that, you know, that's what made librarians like your two characters so good at it. It's like, you know, it's
Yeah.
that attention to detail. And like you said, being able to cull things from tons and tons of information too.
Yeah, and in the Crime Reads article, I talk about Agent Garbo too, and he was phenomenal because he was actually an MI15 agent, but he crafted a network of 27 fictional spies that he told the Germans were based in England that were reporting on British troop activities and movements, and they were completely fictional. And for the first year and a half or so that he was doing it, he'd never even been to England. Eventually MI15 brought him to London when they realized what he was doing. But at first they initially rejected his attempts. He went to them and he said, "Hey, I want to work for you. I want to be a spy." And they said, "No, we don't know who you are. We don't trust you." And so he went to Germany instead. And or not to Germany, but, you know, in Portugal, he was in Lisbon and he went to the Germans and he said, "Hey, I have information." And it was all fiction. It was all crafted narratives. So he wasn't actually in the thick of things, you know, doing the spies and the secret shadows and corners thing. He used his storytelling skills to weave this network of spies, and he was instrumental in D-Day. So he had a huge impact.
Yeah, that was an incredible. I like the fact that that was a real character in history was unbelievable. Yeah,
Yeah.
so good. I want to ask. This is a good. I want to ask about your research because you have very detailed author notes, which I always love in the back of the book, a bibliography. So this is kind of a two-part question. Talk about your research, your process, sources, and also was there anything that you came across in your research? I'm always curious with writers that changed the narrative in a huge way.
Oh, well, I mean, I definitely think that one of the things that changed the whole course of the story actually was when I realized what a huge impact Wolfram had on the
Oh yeah.
war, which a lot of people don't really know that. I knew nothing about it. And when
Yeah,
I
that's actually one of my other questions. So talk about what I didn't either. I didn't know. I vaguely had heard of it, but talk about what Wolfram and the trade of Wolfram in Portugal. Talk about that aspect of and what a big part of the war it was.
Right, right. So when I first started researching Lisbon, I actually read this fantastic book. It's called Lisbon: War in the Shadows of the City of Light by Neil Lockery. And he talked just really briefly about Wolfram. And I thought, oh my gosh, I know nothing about this. So I kind of went down a research rabbit hole right at the very beginning before I'd even outlined the book or done anything like that into wolfram. And for those of you that don't know, wolfram is it's a mineral that contains a metal called tungsten. So in Portugal, it's called wolfram. And in World War II, it was indispensable to both the Allied and Axis powers because they were mining wolfram and they were using it in artillery manufacturing because the metal tungsten is very, very, very strong. And so it created this impenetrable armor. So the Allied and Axis powers, Portugal had a huge wolfram cache during the war. And so they were basically the #1 country in the world with their stores of wolfram. So both the Allied and Axis powers were trading actively with Portugal during the war to try to get their hands on as much of it as possible. But there was this whole black market, there was swindling going on, there was siphoning, the Germans were smuggling it out of the country, and the mines themselves, some of them were actually owned by Portuguese barons and Wolfram barons, but then there were other mines that were owned by Germany. And then, meanwhile, you had the Allies that were trying to take as much too. So eventually, dictator Salazar, who was the prime minister of Portugal during the war, right prior to D-Day, in the months leading up to D-Day, he finally put an embargo on wolfram and stopped exporting it entirely. But if he hadn't made that decision, really, there's no knowing what the actual outcome of the war would have been, which to me was incredible, that this mineral and this metal had such a huge impact, because war is so much industry. And people don't think about that either. Where is the weaponry coming from? Where is the artillery coming from? That was where it was coming from. So the fact that there was this huge smuggling black market that was going on then, and then, I wanted to incorporate that into the story. And I wanted Agent Gable, who was inspired by Agent Garbo, to be in Portugal during that time. So he ended up having that mission, which is totally fictionalized in the book. But I wanted the Wolfram to be a part of it, because it played a huge role in the war.
Yeah, so interesting. And the fact that Portugal was kind of playing both sides,
Yeah.
selling to both, and yeah, so, and all the shady dealings. So you mentioned there's two, obviously there's romance and there's two romantic interests. And you talked about how Garbo, the double agent Garbo, was based on a real historical figure. Talk about the other romantic interest, Raphael, who, oh, I want to make sure I get this right. Um, oh, Luca, sorry.
Luca.
Luca is based on the diplomat Susan Mendez,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Aristides.
and he was an extraordinary historical
Yes.
figure as well. So,
Yes.
yeah, so talk about Luca, the romantic interest, and who his character is based on, because that's
Yeah.
another like origin story that I really loved.
Yeah, so Luca is loosely based on Aristides de Sousa Mendes, who he was the Portuguese consul general during the war, and he was stationed in Bordeaux, France. And he, right after the invasion of Paris in June of 1940, people fled France, and they fled Paris, and they passed through Bordeaux, and he was working there for Portugal, but he was in charge of signing visas and exit papers to allow people into Portugal. Unfortunately, in June of 1940, just prior to that, I believe in 1939, dictator Salazar passed something called Circular 14, which basically prevented more refugees from entering into Portugal, in particular, what Salazar called stateless persons, who unfortunately the predominance of those were Jewish. So at that point in time, when Paris was invaded, there were no more visas that were supposed to be signed to allow people into Portugal. And Aristides de Sousa Mendes completely ignored Salazar's orders. Over the course of several days, he signed thousands of visas. And people that went on to become incredibly famous later, their lives were saved because of this man. So I always think, because I'm also a children's book writer, I think of Margaret and H.A. Rey and Curious George, which, they had the manuscript with them, and he signed their visas and they got into Portugal. So Salazar got wind of what he was doing and tried to shut it down, and he didn't listen. He just kept signing. He asked Salazar for permission. Salazar said no. And then ultimately, his life ended really tragically. I mean, he went to trial. They brought him back to Portugal. The trial was rigged. He was found guilty. All of his property was confiscated, and he ended up dying in poverty. So in the case of Luca Caldera, I changed that. I gave him Sousa Mendes's backstory, and it forms his character, because it's one of the reasons why at the beginning of the novel, when you meet him, he's incredibly cynical, and he's stuck in Portugal and he can't leave, and you don't know why. But he has a different future, and I crafted a romance for him, and a love story, because I guess the romantic in me wanted him to have, a better ending than the one that he got. And it's fascinating because he was basically blacklisted and censored out of Portuguese history for decades. And it wasn't until the 1980s, I believe, that Israel was the first country to really recognize his efforts in rescuing people. And now recently they have a museum that's in his honor in Portugal now. And so everyone is embracing it and talking about it now, and he's become a hero. They call him the Oscar Schindler of Portugal. But his story is just incredible.
Amazing. Yeah, when I read that in your notes, I couldn't believe that he had kind of been buried, right? Like and
Yeah,
he's responsible. I think you in the notes it said like over 3,000 lives at least that they know
yeah,
of, right?
yeah,
So incredible.
yeah.
Um, so I have writing questions, and then I will take questions from the audience after that. So if you have questions for Suzanne, put them in the chat or the Q&A. Did you, this is a dual narrative. Was that always your plan for this story?
That was, yes, my editor and I talked about that at the very beginning. We wanted it to be two separate points of view. And I've done that before. I did it with one of my young adult novels, Serendipity's Footsteps, and that actually had 3 points of view. So that was the first time I took that on. And it is very challenging. I find it very challenging as a writer to do that. But I also find that plot-wise, it can offer certain advantages. For instance, in Bea and Celine's case, I was able to give them 2 separate missions, and they know things, that are happening about each other. They have all these suspicions and things as they interact with each other in the book, because they're keeping secrets from each other. So that really the fact that I had dual points of view really added to the suspense and the tension in the plot because of that, because they see each other doing certain things and they question motives and what's really going on, and there's misunderstandings that happen. So I think it really was necessary for this particular storyline. And also it was just really fun to have 2 separate missions for these librarian spies, and 2 missions that were also very intertwined with Portugal's war history. Um,
Oh,
you
totally.
know,
Yeah.
during the war, there were Nazis in Portugal that were actively seeking out people that had fled there. They didn't want them to leave. So there were people that were being hunted, which is really disturbing that in a neutral country that was occurring. But Salazar, as a dictator, also was he wasn't vocal at all, because he was treading this tightrope of neutrality. So he made sure that anything that was happening that was below board didn't get discussed, and no one knew about it except probably him.
Right, of course.
And the
Yeah.
PVDE, the Portuguese secret police.
Yes.
But yeah, yeah. So the POVs were fun.
So talk to me about, you mentioned plot. What is your writing process? Are you a plotter or are you a pantser? Do you plot things out, or do you write by the seat of your pants? Are you somewhere in between?
I am in between. I have done it both ways. And I will say that when I'm a pantser, there's always a moment when I'm a pantser where I get to a certain point in the manuscript and I get stuck for a period of time. That seems to happen when I'm flying by the seat of my pants. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It usually works out. It's always worked out. But, there's a few excruciating days in there where I literally will sit down at my computer and say, oh my gosh, I had the beginning, I had the ending. What the heck is happening in this moment right here? But it's worked out. When I outlined this particular one was so complicated plot wise, I did a really extensive outline. So that made it easier for me when I went to write it, because I didn't get into the glut of the what is happening in this moment in this chapter. I already had it mapped out. I really outlining is not always fun for me. So I'm so tempted to just be a pantser all the time. But I also secretly know that outlining will help me in the long run. So I think it just kind of depends on the mood I'm in when I take on the story, and also how complex the plot is. If I know I'm doing a really complex plot, because I also did it in Serendipity's Footsteps, I outline that too. There were so many moving pieces. And when you're jumping around in time, I feel like outlining is also very, very helpful. If it's if it's a progressive, naturally progressing through time plot and you're not jumping around, then maybe you can be a pantser.
Well, I find, and you must have found this too, with all the research you had to do for this, that did it help you keep your research organized as well, like plotting things out and like where things, what research you needed where? Like I find that that is one of the reasons I have to have some sort of at least rough outline, because I need to have a way of kind of organizing my research. I'm not super organized, but I do my best, you know? So
Yeah.
um, yeah, I feel like that's, I do you use Microsoft Word or you Scrivener?
I
Um,
use Word. I keep hearing about Scrivener, and I don't have the time right now to learn a whole new process, but I'm so intrigued. I want to check it out.
yes.
But I've used Word for, for 20 something years. So I think I need a little bit of free time to learn a new program. And then I would love to see what it does and what its capabilities are.
Yes,
And
it's pretty, yeah, Scrivener, and it's really inexpensive. And I've probably only used like 20% of its capabilities, but I like it for organizing research and outlining and all that stuff. So,
yeah,
but people, I understand, like Word is also still my like go-to for like later on drafts. And I don't think I'll ever go to Google Docs or anything else.
yeah.
Yeah.
I've always used Word, but I think part of that is probably um, residual after effects from me being an editor for almost a decade
Oh
too.
yeah, that's right too. Yeah.
Because I mean, back when I was an editor, we actually, now you do track changes and everything in Microsoft Word. And when I was editing, it was all by hand. We were doing all the line editing by hand still and mailing the manuscripts back to the authors. And it was so much fun. And then
Yeah.
I remember when track changes got introduced as a writer, it made me completely paranoid for a little while. I did not trust the
Oh yeah.
technology at all.
Of course. I totally get
I
that.
trusted my red pencil.
Yes, the red pencil always. I know. So you've written a number of books for young people, and this is your first adult novel, historical fiction. What was different about this process compared to your past books?
Um, I wouldn't say that the process was necessarily different. I would say in a way it was liberating to write for adults because as a YA and middle grade author, I always keep in the back of my mind where my readers are developmentally, what themes and context I'm using in the book and how it's going to resonate with them and they're going to relate to it. And with adult novels, I still thought about that, but I wasn't constantly thinking about, what's the maturity level of the readers that I'm writing for, and is this too mature of a concept for them? And, I'm a very firm believer in using sophisticated language in writing for kids too. I am, the children's literature world is full of some of the most amazing literature that I've probably ever read. And the same can be said for adult lit too. It's just, it's a overflowing fountain of talent in both of those worlds. Um, so it's not really changing the vocabulary, but it's just more the freedom to play with concepts that are adult concepts and,
Right.
not have to worry about that. So that was really liberating.
Oh, that's
Um,
great.
Yeah, but the process is still very much the same. And I would actually argue that with children's writing, especially with middle grade, when you're trying to keep a story succinct and you don't want it to get too unruly with page count, you're thinking about your word count a lot. And,
Mhm.
how long are these chapters? Am I going to lose my reader if I have a 10-page chapter? So those things still hold true to the adult market too, because you always want to keep that forward momentum. But I think in the children's world also, are my paragraphs too long? How do I want to break up this page so it's not overwhelming?
Yeah, the parameters are a little tighter.
Yeah.
I would imagine for that. Yeah, yeah, interesting. Um, how did you strike a balance between fact and fiction in this novel? And were there any strict rules that you had as you were writing it in terms of fact versus fiction?
I didn't really have any strict rules. I think it was more conscious decisions along the way of what I wanted to include as far as, especially with regard to, I would say, Agent Gable and Luca Caldera, because those two characters I based probably more on their real personas in history, their true historical figures. At least their backstories were relatively similar. Um, I didn't have a whole lot of information about their personalities, so that was fictional, but it was kind of, how I imagined that after everything had happened to Aristides de Sousa Mendez, I would imagine that he would have been completely disillusioned and
And
cynical
cynical. Yeah.
about about his home country and
Hmm.
about Salazar, this man that
Oh,
he was
yeah.
working for, that, and he did say, up until he died, he said, I did what my conscience told me to do. And that was his response, for saving people and disregarding the rules. Um, so with both of those men, as I was crafting their characters, I had to make decisions about how I wanted their futures to be. I mean, I didn't want Agent Gable, my fictional Agent Gable, to go off to Britain halfway through the story, which is actually what happened in real life. I wanted him to hang in there in Portugal. And Luca, I wanted him to have a different ending than the one that he had in real life, and a chance at finding redemption and love,
Hmm.
and also to find hope again after being so ruined by his country. I wanted him to have that chance. So a lot of it was just making conscious decisions along the way. And Selene and Bea were such a mashup of different spies and librarians and academics that I encountered in my research, that I didn't really have to think about their stories and their futures, and everything was much more fictional. But I think
Hmm.
anytime you're mixing fiction and nonfiction, you do have to be careful. If I had written Agent Garbo and written him as a real person, I would have had to do it totally differently than the way that I did. I would have taken a totally different tack than the one that I did. And the same with Aristides de Sousa Mendez. If I were going to write him as a character, it would have been a totally different process, because I would have
Yeah.
been a lot more conscientious of being true to who they were as individuals, and not fictionalizing their personalities and that sort of thing.
Yeah. That makes total sense. I've run into that. And yeah, I completely relate. Um, so you have been an editor and you've taught writing and you've published a bunch of books. What's the best advice you can give to aspiring authors about writing and getting published?
So, for a long time, when I was first starting out, when I was an editorial assistant and I was working on other people's books, and meanwhile I was frantically, behind closed doors, telling no one that I was secretly writing my own and submitting my own and getting rejected, and nobody knew. And I was very much in love with just writing as a craft. And language. And it took me a really long time and a lot of working on other people's manuscripts and a lot of writing cover copy for those books and figuring out what the sale points for those books were for me to kind of wrap my head around the idea that whatever I was writing, if I had any hope of it getting out of my door and into other readers' hands, it had to have something propelling it forward constantly from the first page to the end. And whether you're writing a character-driven story where the evolution of the characters is and their relationships with each other is the crux of the narrative, or you're writing a completely plot-driven story, or you're writing a combination of both, you always have to keep in mind that forward momentum, always, always. And you're not writing to the market, but you're writing with your readers in mind. Are they still going to be hanging in there on page 50, on page 100, on page 150? What are you giving them that's going to make them keep turning the pages? And early on in my career, I did a lot of writing under pseudonyms, work for hire pieces. And that helped me a lot too, because those were so plot driven. And I was also one of several authors that were writing for any one series under these pseudonyms. So I would say be writing books 2 and 4 while another author was writing book 1 and 3. And we had what was called a Bible of characters. And those characters had predetermined personalities. And we had to make our voices sound the same in the writing so that, whoever was reading the series wouldn't be able to tell that there were different authors. And that was a huge challenge, but it also taught me so much about plotting and about writing to point. And I would say that that's a great process for anyone to actually experiment with and take on because you learn so much.
Oh yeah, I was like that must have been like a class in itself on how to like structure a book, beginning, middle, end. Yeah, and carry it through. That's fascinating. That must have
Yeah.
been like a really good education.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you also have to, it takes a lot of discipline too, because you can't let yourself, all the places that your brain is going with all the different things that you want to do with you can't. You just hone in on what you're told to do. It's a
Right.
great exercise.
Yeah.
And so that was really early on in my career. And I feel like that it really hit home with me how important that momentum is for every
Yes.
book.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Momentum, structure, forward
yeah.
motion. Yeah, completely. That was a hard lesson for me to learn. It took me a lot longer than
Yeah.
that. Um, so how can readers best keep in touch with you, and do you Zoom with book clubs?
I do Zoom with book clubs, yes, and I do it for free. There is a link on my website. If you go to www.suzannenelson.com and you click on the adult, there's two different branches of my website. There's the children's branch and the adult branch. So you click on the adult branch and under contact, there's a form that anyone can fill out for a book club chat request. I do them online. If I'm nearby you, then maybe I can do it in person as time allows. So I do that. I'm also on TikTok and Instagram at Suzanne Nelson Books, on Twitter at Suzanne Nelson Books, or X on Suzanne Nelson Books, and Facebook, Suzanne Nelson Books. So you can find me all over the place.
Excellent. We have time for a couple quick questions, and in the Q&A, it's basically the same question, which is by two people. Did you travel to Portugal as part of your research?
I did. I did
Right.
travel to Portugal. I was there in November, and actually, I had a draft of the book already done when I
Oh, wow.
went. Yeah, when I went. So I went, I will admit, I went with a little bit of trepidation because I I was there and I thought, oh my gosh, what's going to happen if I get there and all the research that I've done is, and I've written this whole thing and I've created this whole world and this environment. And what if it's completely wrong? So I was very relieved when I got there and it was, it was true to what I had written and the research that I'd done, which was a huge relief. And it was also great because I was able to go to all the places that I included in the book
Nice.
and and talk about them. I actually, for anyone who is interested and looks up my TikToks or my Instagrams, I have a lot of videos where I'm actually, and there will be more coming in coming weeks, where I take you to the location so you can see exactly what it looks like. And then when you're reading the book, you have a frame of reference for that particular location in the story. So it was amazing to be there, and also very, very eye-opening, because in all my research, um, especially when it came to dictator Salazar, I I understood who he was on the periphery, but there's this fascinating museum for anyone who travels to Lisbon. It's called the Aljube Museum of Resistance and Freedom. And it used to be a prison. And you go there, and there's these amazing displays about the censorship and what he did to maintain control while he was prime minister. It's actually quite terrifying, but it's also just so incredibly informative and moving. And it gives you a really great context for the environment that Portugal was during that time, because he was prime minister for a very long time. And then eventually became incapacitated. And what was so fascinating was his government continued. They basically hid the fact that he was incapacitated, and he maintained power even though he was completely incapacitated. Yeah. So that was really fascinating. But Lisbon is this fantastic city, and it's just Alfama, which is one of the places that Selene does some of her spy work in the novel, is just this maze of little tiny alleyways and stairways and these tiny little buildings with these little doorways that you have to kind of crouch down to walk through. It's so beautiful. And right in the middle of all these buildings, you see these, not groves of orange trees, but you'll see, like 2 or 3 orange trees just coming right out of the pavement, basically. And they had fruit on them in November when I was there.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I
Yeah.
haven't been to Lisbon. That is on my list. Audrey Tiedemann says traveled to Portugal last year, just amazing. Someone asked, is Porto mentioned in the book? I know they had a huge Jewish population there.
No, yeah,
And
Porto's not in the book. It's predominantly it's Lisbon and then Sintra and Estoril.
mhm.
Because most of the spy craft that was going on in World War II was in those areas, especially Estoril, which is a very short train ride from Lisbon. That place is just fascinating because that's where Ian Fleming, as a naval secretary, drew inspiration for his James Bond character. And the Hotel Palacio is there, and they have the spy bar, and that's where Agent Garbo hung out, and also another double agent, Dusko Popoff, who was the inspiration for James Bond, hung out in the Hotel Palacio and the spy bar. So, I mean, it's just such a font of fun spy information and history. It's great.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, that question was Carol Cohen. Thank you, Carol. One more question, because we're running out of time. Christine Mott asked, and I should have asked this. What made you decide to write an adult book after writing children's books for so long? I didn't even ask
Oh,
you that. Like, why now did you decide to?
so I've wanted to write historical fiction adult novels for a very, very long time. Part of it was the timing, because I was, for Scholastic, I wrote a whole series of 10 foodie books, including You're Baking Me Crazy. And those were coming out basically one a year. So for almost 10 years, I was just consumed with writing those. So I really didn't have a whole lot of time. But I was very, very fortunate with this book, because actually my publisher Zando approached my agent and said, "Do you know any children's book YA authors that would want to actually take a stab at writing historical fiction?" And I basically was like, "Oh, me."
Amazing. Yeah, that's amazing.
Yes. So I'm eternally grateful to my editor at Zando and my agent, because my agent, basically texted me right away, and she said, "Suze, you have to do this."
I love that story. That's so
Yeah.
cool. That's awesome. Um,
Yeah.
Suzanne, this was lovely. Thank you so much. Congratulations again. The Librarians of Lisbon just came out, and Suzanne does book clubs via Zoom. Um, and you know where to get in touch with her. Thank you again for coming on. And next up is 2 weeks from tonight. We have Jane Yang to talk about the Lotus shoes. You can register at janehealy.com. And I should probably give a shout out. My husband would be mad if I didn't. The Women of Arlington Hall, my book that's coming out this summer, is available for pre-order. And yeah, that's it. So thank you so much. Remember to like and subscribe YouTube and follow the podcast. Thank you, everyone. As always, this is an amazing crowd on this cold night, and I wish you so much success, Suzanne, with this
Thank
amazing book.
you. And same
Congratulations
to you.
again.
I'm so excited about your book. I can't wait to
Oh,
read it.
thank you. Thank you so much. Good night, everyone. Thank you.